Thank you, Cindy. When I moved back here in 2011, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, I guess you've come back for all the new cultural opportunities." I said, "Well, the only cultural opportunities I know about are the Central Library and the Red Key." So I still hold those high, but since then I've gotten to know Cindy Booth, and she is an entire cultural opportunity herself.
I'm going to adjust your microphone, just speak into it a little bit more.
Oh, all right. So, yes, I've been talking with my friend John Myers before about how this is kind of a pokey city. It's a hard city to make things happen in. And really, the first person I've met who can make good things happen is Cindy Booth. So I am a great fan of hers and of child advocates. And I'm very glad to be here and be able to tell you about some of these experiences. You know, after the 1954 Supreme Court decision that outlawed segregation in the public schools, there was a kind of eerie silence. And people wondered what was going to happen, because we knew that the white South was not going to just sit there and peacefully go about integrating schools, nor in fact was the North or anywhere else. So it was waiting, as if you're waiting for an explosion. And suddenly in September of 1955, the explosion came, with headlines in every paper saying a 14-year-old boy from Chicago had been murdered in Mississippi for the crime of whistling at a white woman. This was Emmett Till, whose mother had sent him down to visit his grandfather, and she had given him some instructions before he went, but he evidently didn't remember those. She said, if you ever get into any difficulty with a white person, just kneel down and ask their forgiveness. But he didn't think he'd been in any trouble. He didn't think he'd caused any trouble, because whether he whistled at this woman or not, nobody ever knew. But supposedly he for God's sake, looked at her, and maybe he said, "Oh, you're nice," or something. Nobody ever knows. But the point is, late that night, when he was asleep in his grandfather's house, there was knocking on the door, and in came a big man named J.W. Milam, who said, "We want the boy from Chicago." So Moses Wright took him back and woke up Emmett Till, and Milam said to him, "Get dressed, you're coming with us." And Emmett got dressed, went with them, and he was never seen again until he was found, his body was found the bottom of the Tallahatchie River with a 70-pound cotton gin fan tied around his neck. And it was obvious from the body that he had been tortured and then murdered for this crime. Well, reading about this, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is a historic event. I really want to go there. I want to see what it's like. I want to see what's happening. But I had just gotten out of college 6 months before, and I had never published anything nationally. I had published things in the Indianapolis Star sports section and the Grand Rapids Press, and in my first job on the Princeton Packet, New Jersey's oldest weekly. But that was hardly enough to qualify me to get an assignment. But I had met, while working in New Jersey, in Princeton, New Jersey, I met a man named Murray Kempton, who was really my hero. He was a columnist for the New York Post, and I had reviewed his book, part of our time, about the 1930s, when I was working on the paper in Princeton. So kind of out of desperation, I called him up and I said, listen, we've just met once and I know you like my review of your book, but is there anybody, is there any magazine, any newspaper, anybody that would send me to Mississippi to cover the Emmett Till murder trial? And he said, well, let me think about it. And he called me back a day later and he said, well, go down to the office of the Nation magazine and they'll give you what they can pay you. So I was amazed and elated. And in fact, I've often wondered since, what in the world did he tell them? But anyway, they did want me to cover the story. And their payment, well, some of you who read the Nation may know Calvin Trillin, who has written for them for years. He once said, the Nation is famous for paying in the low two figures. So when I went for my payment, my payment was a round-trip bus ticket to Sumner, Mississippi. And man, that thing folded out like an accordion. It stopped at every burg between New York and the Mississippi Delta. And I think it took 2 days and 1 night. And then it didn't really take you all the way to Sumner, Mississippi. It took you 2 miles away where there was a sign pointing to Sumner and said, a good place to raise a boy. Well, nobody had evidently considered the irony of that, but I walked the 2 miles and I got a room in a rooming house right on the town square. And it was an amazing scene. The trial started on Monday. There were reporters from all over the country and even all over the world. There were people there from London and Paris. And one of the locals stopped by and asked me where I was from. I said, New York. He said, wow. He said, people from all over. Never saw us making such a mountain out of a molehill. The molehill was the murder. Well, the courthouse lawn was segregated too, just automatically. And the black people were all standing around a statue of a Confederate soldier that said, the cause that never failed. And sometimes I have this awful feeling that that was true. Some of the local people, the sheriffs and the sheriff deputies inside the courthouse came over to some of the reporters and said, you know, those dressed up Negroes are not ours. Ours are out picking cotton and minding their business. So I was at a little press table with there were a couple of press tables, and then the black reporters had a little tiny press tables way back in the corner, but at least they were in the room. And we were looking at these 2 men who were known to be the murderers. Nobody questioned that, in fact. J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant. And Milam was the big guy who was very menacing looking character. And I was following Murray Kempton around as kind of as my guide as a reporter. And during one of the breaks, he went up to Milam and he said, hot enough for you, J.W.? And J.W. looked at him and said, hot enough to make a man feel mean. And it was a mean, not nice statement. By the way, there was I got a call about 4 years ago from a man who was very apologetic. And he said, you know, I know you get a lot of these calls, and I hate to bother you, but I'm writing a book about the Emmett Till murder trial, and you're the only one who was there who's still alive. So that's my distinction. But watching this trial was really one of the most dramatic things I've ever seen. For one thing, the main witness was Moses Wright, who was 64 years old, and he'd been told by J.W. Milam, if you remember who came here tonight, you won't live to be 65. And so the white town residents were saying, well, Mo's right. Old Mose is a good man. He won't say anything. He won't get up and testify. But Moses Wright came to that courthouse, and he had on a new white shirt and yellow suspenders and blue pants, and he stood up as straight as a ramrod, and he identified J.W. Milam as the man who came to his house and took the boy. And he was a great witness. He never bumbled a moment. He was ramrod straight through the whole thing. And then there was a great to-do when Emmett Till's mother came, Mamie Bradley. And in that courthouse in Mississippi, no one was allowed to call her Mrs. Bradley. They all had to call her Mamie. And in fact, one of the local radio stations referred to her as Mrs. Bradley and received all kind of calls of protest from people objecting to that. Well, anyway, I'm watching all this go on, and I was really very naive. And I was so naive that I heard that there was a prisoner in a little town nearby called Itabena, and that he was possibly a key witness to the case. So I thought, wow, if I could get to that little town. And then I heard that two of the sheriff's deputies were going to that town. So I went up to one of them, and I said, excuse me, I hear you're going to Itabena. Can I ride along with you? He says, where are you from, boy? I said, well, I'm in New York. He looked at his partner. He said, okay, come on, boy. So I get in the car, and they drove in silence with me for about 5 miles. Then they stopped the car, said, this is where you get out, boy. So later, when I told Murray and the other reporters, they said, you're lucky that they just told you to get out. But when I got out, I had to walk back to the town. And I'm walking back on this dirt road, and I looked to my left, and for the first time, I saw where the black people lived in that town. And those were in like tar paper shacks, and they were sitting out, and I just walked by in silence and went back, continued going to the courtroom, and I didn't say anything. I didn't make any complaints to the sheriff. And I have to say that the prosecuting attorney, who was the prosecuting attorney for the state of Mississippi, really did a good job. He was very sincere, very serious. He presented evidence that was unquestionable. He presented a great case. And when he made his summation, he began by saying, the first words of testimony here were dripping with the blood of Emmett Till. And everybody knew that. And yet, everybody, all the white townspeople, seemed to be confident that the men would be let free. And when the defense attorney finished his last speech to the jury, he ended up saying, I'm sure that every Anglo-Saxon one of you will want to set these men free. And that, in fact, is what happened. And it only took them an hour and 5 minutes, the jury, and that was because it took them a long time to figure out how they filled out the report. And people filed out, and Murray Kempton said to me, "You're not going to stay here in town, are you, tonight?" I said, "Well, I thought I would." He said, "You better come back to Jackson and get a motel." So I went back to Jackson, got a motel, and I knew that I had to file my story Sunday morning. And I'm pretty sure that I sat up all of Friday night and Saturday night. And in those days, this is long before computers, this is even before electric typewriters. And so you had to go to the Western Union office like you were sending a telegram, and you gave them the story you'd written. And I was proud of what I had done. In fact, I can still remember the first sentence of that story. And it was, "The crowds are gone, and this sleepy Delta town is back to its silent, solid life that is based on cotton and the proposition that a whole race of men was created to pick it." And I later felt that was the best sentence I ever wrote. And in a way, that's kind of discouraging because I still feel that. But James Baldwin, who I was beginning to read, wrote, "The South thinks that it knows the Negro. The North thinks it has set him free. Both camps are deluded." And Baldwin at that time had written 3 novels, and each of those novels broke one of the great taboos of the era. The first was Go Tell It Out in the Mountain, which was about a young black boy becoming a street corner minister and growing up in Harlem. Nobody had ever written about Harlem in that way before. And the next was Giovanni's Room. And that was a love story between 2 white men. And it was the only gay love novel that had been published at that time, except for one by Gore Vidal. And then his third novel was called Another Country, and that was about an interracial love affair. So he had broken all the taboos, and he'd also written a wonderful book of essays called Notes of a Native Son. But Baldwin, as well as his really profound and effective articles and novels, he really had a great sense of humor. I'll never forget, he was interviewed on television once by this very kind of over-serious guy who said, "Mr. Baldwin, you were born black, poor, and homosexual. Do you think you have 3 strikes against you?" And Baldwin smiled and said, "Why, no, I thought I'd hit the jackpot." I met Baldwin at the White Horse Tavern, which is, in those days in New York, in Greenwich Village, the bars were segregated, but not racially, but by profession. If you were a writer, you went to the White Horse. If you were a painter, you went to the Cedar Bar. If you were an actor, you went to Louis' Tavern. And then everybody went to the 5 Spot, which was the great jazz place, no cover, no minimum, and John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk were the house band. So that was a pretty good deal. And beer was 15 cents. At any rate, at this time, there was a paperback of Baldwin's book, Notes of a Native Son, and it had a picture of him on the cover. The cover was simply James Baldwin's face. And so one night I went into the White Horse, and there he was. And I was really thrilled because that book had really excited me about being a writer. And the autobiographical notes at the beginning ended up with a sentence that I will always remember. He said in summation, "I want to be an honest man and a good writer." I thought, wow, what better goals could you have? So I asked one of the regulars at the White Horse if he'd introduce me to Baldwin, and he took me over and introduced me, and I said I was a writer and that I was writing a book on Spanish Harlem, and he said, well, sit down and have a drink, and we talked, and then he invited me to come to his apartment the next afternoon. He lived on Horatio Street, which was not far from the White Horse. And there were a series of great afternoons going to Horatio Street and drinking bourbon and listening to Bessie Smith. And that's all he played was Bessie Smith. And we talked about everything, and he gave me great advice about writing and about life. And he's told me once that he had just been down to give a talk at Howard University. And one of the old professors there had said to him, "Jimmy, I want you to know, when you end up, you got to have a shelf of books, a whole shelf." And Baldwin turned to me and he says, "That goes for you too, baby, a shelf of books, a whole shelf." And that really stuck with me. We were friends, and we went to parties together sometimes. I remember going to one party in the village. It was winter, and he had this big Russian hat, if you know those hats that sit up real high on your head, and he loved that hat, and he wore that inside at the party. And he said to me, I've got to make a phone call because I'm in a price war on Madison Avenue, and which meant that two different publishers were bidding on his next book. So he said, I've got to call, and the editor he had to call happened to be a guy who I really didn't like and who'd been kind of nasty to me. And I told that to Baldwin. So when he called this editor, he said, "Hi, this is Jimmy Baldwin. I'm here with my friend Dan Wakefield." So that was really nice. And one night, Baldwin invited me to go to dinner with him at his friend Mary Painter's house. And Mary Painter was maybe his closest friend. He had met her in Paris when she was working at the United States Embassy, and he was living there writing. And later, if you ever read his book, The Fire Next Time, he talks about the first time he went to see Elijah Muhammad, the head of the black Muslims. And he said, at one point, Elijah said to him, "You don't have any white friends, do you?" And Jimmy said, "Yes," and he was thinking of Mary Painter. Well, that night, I will never forget when we went to her house for dinner. Mainly, I remember the thunder. It was a terrible night. And there was thunder and lightning and rain like crazy. And we were walking without any umbrellas up 7th Avenue to her apartment, about 7 or 8 blocks away. And she was, the reason she invited Jimmy to come was that she had a friend from France, a French woman who had come there. And she wanted the French woman to meet Baldwin. So we, like all the dinners I ever went to in the village, we started out drinking a whole lot of bourbon, and then we sit down at the table, and then we started drinking wine, and we were talking with the wisdom of bourbon and wine. And then Jimmy got very serious, and he said he was very worried about his younger sister because she wanted to be a fashion designer. And she was 16, and she was black, and she was suffering. And the French woman said, well, I have a sister who's 16, and she's suffering too. All 16-year-olds are suffering. And from my bourbon-filled wisdom, I piped up and said, oh yeah, I was suffering when I was 16. And he turned to me and he said, you don't understand. And it was awful. It was like a knife going through me. And things were really never the same. He invited me to his sister's fashion show, and I took a friend of mine with me and introduced him, and Jimmy shook hands and he took us around, but he was almost ferocious. He was just saying, this is that. It was terrible. And I felt very badly about it. I was invited a year or so later, he invited me to a book party for a new book of essays called Nobody Knows My Name. And it was at Small's Paradise in Harlem. I think by then it was Wilt Chamberlain's Small's Paradise, but it was a very good place for a party. And he seemed friendly, but we never really talked again. When I left New York in 1963, and I went for a year on a fellowship at Harvard, and then I ended up living in Boston most of my life. And I only saw Baldwin one more time, and that was in 1977. We were both in Chicago, and we were both promoting books. And he was promoting his wonderful book about the movies called, oh my God, what's the book about the movies? The Devil Finds Work. And I was there talking about a book I'd written about a soap opera. So anyway, and I was supposed to be on the radio that night. And the radio station called, and they said, well, James Baldwin is going to be on our show tonight, and said he has a terrible sore throat. And he said, you are a friend of his, and would you mind coming on with him instead of you having your own time? And I said, of course, I'll be glad to do that. And I got to tell you, the idea of me talking about soap operas while he was talking about his book on the movies was not, it was ridiculous. So we somehow got through that, and he did have a very bad throat, like I have now, and I don't think he had one of these. And afterwards, he offered to give me a ride back to my hotel, and he had a driver driving him. And I remember he still had on that Russian hat. And we really didn't talk much. And he thanked me and went on. But as I say, nothing was ever the same after that night of the thunder. And I later read an essay he had written in which there was a quote of his. He quoted Henry James, who was his favorite writer, and really my favorite writer too. And there was a phrase that just stuck with me. Henry James was talking about what he called the terrible algebra of your own existence. And I thought, you know, that's what it is. I can't figure out the algebra of Jimmy's existence, and I want to. And I've thought about that very often since. And about 2 years ago, people started telling me to read a book called Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And what they said was, oh, it's just like Baldwin. And that just put me off of it, because I thought, nobody's like Baldwin. I don't want to hear this stuff. And people kept mentioning it to me, and I kept making excuses. And my advice from that is, whenever you're resisting a book, it means you really ought to read it. So I read Between the World and Me. I'm sure many of you have read that. And it was like Baldwin in the sense that I felt it was like if Baldwin were living today, this was what he would be saying. And the book is like a letter to Coates' son. And he's telling his son that he can't protect him, that the most terrible thing he has to live with is that he doesn't feel he can protect his body or his son's, because to be black in this country means that your body is not your own, and that any time a police car could stop you for any reason, and you might be let go and you might never be seen again. And that really shook me, because I realized around the same time I'm reading that is when it seems like every month there's a new black man killed by the police. And reading that with the book was like affirming what the book was saying. And you know, it was just that terrible procession, beginning with Trayvon Martin, or that's what I remember, because I was living in Florida, and going on these other people, and Tamir Rice, the little kid who was shot in the back. And I began to see that part of what I thought of as the algebra of Baldwin's existence. And what I had not understood was that, okay, everybody has their own suffering, teenage suffering, midlife suffering, marriage suffering, divorce suffering, whatever it is, but for the black, there is on top of that all the fear for your own body. And I felt like I began to understand something. And a lot of things were coming at me then that were helping me at least to begin to understand. And one of them was I went to a poetry reading, which was called a reprise poetry reading, and it was right after the election. And one of the poets was a young black woman who some of you may know, Tasha Jones. And she read this amazing poem that she had written. And her poem is called From Pyramids to Plantations to Projects to Penitentiaries. And I got to know Tasha Jones, and she was teaching at Tenley School, and she invited me to come to her class and tell them about the Emmett Till case. And one of the things she taught her class of 12-year-old boys was what to do if they were confronted by a policeman. And she told them if they were in a group, to break up the group, to not be walking more than two at a time. And she told them to be sure to have your hands at your sides and not in your pockets, and to say, "Yes, sir." And she went on with this, and I'm thinking, boy, when I was at School 80 in Shortridge, nobody had to tell me that. And you know, it was a whole other thing, and it also reinforced what I had been reading from Coates. And you know, sometimes you're sitting down in your little White House, and some of these things think, oh, you know, maybe that writer was just a little bit far out, and maybe things aren't really that bad. And then this morning, I woke up and got the New York Times, and the whole editorial page of the Times is a graph about the penitentiary system and how from 200,000 people in penitentiaries in 1970, there are now 1.4 million black men in penitentiaries in this country. And the New York Times, not given to joking or ribaldry, said the scope of this is so enormous it amounts to a government housing program. And I think that really is accurate. It sums it up. And when you start to try to absorb these things and you begin to read a little, I realized something shocking. I don't know anything about American history. I thought I had a great education. I went to School 80 in Shortridge. I went to Columbia, and yet all I knew was what I was told about. And as Baldwin explained, when you read about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and you see that they say all men are created equal. Well, if you count black men and women, that doesn't make any sense. So the answer to that is to say they're not people. The whole thing is who defines people. And so that was really a key to beginning to understand what I had been taught and what I had not been taught. And I read a recent book of Coates called We Were 8 Years in Power. And some people criticized that book saying, well, really, we weren't really in power in Obama's years. That wasn't really very powerful as we hoped it would be for black people. And then I realized when I read the book, he wasn't even talking about the Obama years. That was a quote from a South Carolina black congressman in 1895. And the congressman, named Thomas Miller, was pleading. He had been in office for 8 years during Reconstruction. And he was pleading with the now white authorities who had taken over again in what was an era called redemption. I never heard about that. And in fact, my understanding of Reconstruction was what I saw in the movie of Gone with the Wind. And I think that's about the level of most of our understandings. And what I realized was I don't know the history of my own country, and I don't know the history of my own city. And I'm just beginning to learn a little of that. And there's a new book called Indiana Avenue, Life and Musical Journey from 1915 to 2015. The subtitle is Ragtime, Blues, Jazz, Spiritual, Bebop, Doo-Wop, Motown, Opera, and Hip Hop. And it's by Alida Hodge, who's here tonight. So I hope you'll stand up. Alida. And Sunday night, she'll be at my guest at Uncle Dan's Book Nerds at the Aristocrat Pub on the second floor. And we'll talk about her book more. And I learned a great deal in the book, not only about the great jazz history of this city, which I had never heard about. The only thing I'd ever heard about Indiana Avenue, my friend John will tell you that in high school, well, he went to Lawrence Central, I went to Shortridge, but we were both told that if you wanted to prove your bravery, your courage, you should drive down Indiana Avenue and roll down your windows and see if you could brave not being hit by a knife. That was the word. And I had no idea. Well, the only jazz musician I knew from here was J.J. Johnson because I met him in New York. But I didn't know anything. I didn't know that he had started out on Indiana Avenue. I didn't know that Hoagie Carmichael had learned most of the stuff he learned by going to Indiana Avenue every weekend. And, you know, when I was a kid, listening to the radio at home on Winthrop, just over by the Monon, and my favorite group, my favorite music was the Ink Spots. And you know, I would have been thrilled to know that they were from Indianapolis. But nobody told me that. Nobody told me about Wes Montgomery. Nobody told me about the man who went to Butler, who with U.B. Blake wrote a musical called Shuffle Along that was put on Broadway. It was the first non-minstrel show musical ever to be on Broadway. And it was revived 2 years ago in New York because its impact had been so great. And the revival had gotten 15 nominations for Emmys. So this history, which we ought to be proud of, being from this city, and we don't have that much, and here's this incredible musical history. And in fact, Wes Montgomery, who is credited with really creating the way the guitar is used in jazz, and Jimi Hendrix once came here to study with Wes Montgomery, but never heard anything about all that. And it's quite amazing that there's a new book, a book called The New History of Indiana. It doesn't have any reference to Indiana Avenue. It doesn't have any reference to music or musicians. And I don't know any other book that does it. Well, there are 3 other books about Indiana Avenue, and all of them are written by black people. I don't know where this is mentioned in any white authors. By the way, that musical called Shuffle Along was called by Langston Hughes, credited with beginning the Harlem Renaissance. It was that much of an impact. By the way, that same man who wrote that also wrote the Butler fight song. Is that the one, we'll sing the Butler war song? But nobody knows, we don't know about that. Sometime last year, I was looking for something to watch on Hulu, and I saw there was a show called Dear White People. So I thought, well, I'll try that. And it was a lot of fun. And the young woman, it was about a college campus, and there was a young black woman who had a radio program called Dear White People. And she talked about some people in the college being woke. And I know that here in Indianapolis, probably in the world, in this country, I mean, some white people who think they're woke, and man, we're just rubbing our eyes. And the one thing I thought of that would be a positive thing to say is a story, it's very short, I'd like to read you from the book of Mark. He cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the room. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. After that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored and saw every man clearly. My great hope is that we learn to see every man and every woman clearly. Thank you.